Empire building. How did post-war Europe transcend nationalism? In the previous lecture I talked about how the advent of atomic bomb technology has, on the one hand, put an end to wars between great powers, and, on the other hand, made the nation-state no longer a viable political unit, but one that has to be constructed on an imperial scale in order to be viable. By empire, we mean an alliance of states that goes beyond individual states. This coalition of states had to transcend nationalism, and be backed up by some kind of universalist values in order to gain cohesion. But as you know, at that time there were already universal values like liberalism and communism, with Anglo-American-dominated empires and Soviet-dominated empires. However, most European countries were still nation-states that believed in nationalism. So how were the European countries to complete the conceptual transformation and integrate into this age of empire? Universal rules provided by the empire. In this talk we will answer these questions. Let's start by looking at how modern empires are constructed. As I said in the previous lecture, a modern empire is a federation of states, which has to have a central dominant or hegemonic state, whose identity is based on some kind of commitment to values beyond those of the individual states. How do you ensure that the hegemonic state will be able to build order beyond its own values? In fact, even without considering the question of values, from a purely utilitarian point of view, we find that it is in the interests of the hegemonic state to structure the international order in a way that goes beyond its own. An analogy is easy to understand. We can liken national interests to doing business in a large shopping mall where each country rents a shop. If you are a megastate, or if you are a dominant state, you are not just running your own shop in a shopping mall, you are also the majority shareholder in the mall. For the majority shareholder, the biggest benefit is never to increase the flow of water from your own shop, but whether you have the opportunity to collect rent from all the small and medium-sized shops. So the question is, if there are two competing malls, what makes your mall attractive to the small and medium-sized businesses that pay rent to you? Where the level of property management is similar, SMEs will have to compare the management rules of the two malls to see whether the rules require all SMEs to revolve around the majority shareholder, or whether the rules generally bind all businesses, including the majority shareholder itself. If the former is the case, and the interests of the small and medium-sized businesses revolve around the majority shareholder, then the small and medium-sized businesses will not be able to form any stable expectations of their own profitability, as the majority shareholder can adjust the rules for its own benefit at any time. Such an administration of the rules would be tantamount to integrating the world with a nationalistic scheme that requires the entire world order to be reconfigured around the interests of the hegemonic state. In the latter case, the rules would be universally binding on all businesses, including major shareholders. The small and medium-sized businessman would have a stable expectation of his own profitability, knowing that although he would not be able to eat meat because he is too small, he would be sure that he would be able to eat soup within the rules. In this situation, it is self-evident which mall the SME will ultimately choose. The confrontation between these two rules of governance has been real in history. If Nazi Germany dominates, its demand is that the interests of all other countries revolve around itself, as it explains that the Germans are the best race in the world, that the inferior is subordinate to the superior, and that it is also the best choice in terms of overall human development. In the United States and the Soviet Union, which confronted the Nazis, their two options were both universalist options. The problems posed by nationalism. The defeat of the Nazis was inevitable, and arguably even doomed from the very beginning of the war. Because a war for world domination cannot be fought by blitzkrieg, it has to be fought by prolonged warfare. In the end, it is not about who has the better generals, but who has the stronger and more efficient ability to mobilize resources. A nationalist program cannot mobilize resources from any country other than its own. The universalist program, on the other hand, could mobilize the resources of all countries except the enemy. So the Nazis' failure was inevitable, and chance was only a matter of how long it would take, and at what cost it would fail. If the nation-state is not destined to integrate the world, you may ask here, why did the idea of the nation-state emerge in the era of the Revolution, and why did it prevail in the era of the Great War? This in turn has to do with a specific historical phase. The benefits of nationalism in times of great revolutions, when the world was far from being completely divided, and there was plenty of room for nationalist countries to expand, rather than having to confront other countries head-on, outweighed the costs. But in the era of the Great War, when the world has been carved up, and the great powers have to confront each other head-on, nationalism will be out of the question at this point in time. But the inertia of the previous era is still there, which is why some countries such as Germany are still using nationalist solutions, which, as the two world wars proved, have come to an end. The idea of a Latin Catholic empire. Such a view is not a summary of today's times, but was already clearly stated by thinkers at the time. Towards the end of the Second World War, one of the great French thinkers, Cogeve, put forward this idea in a long essay he wrote, entitled The French National Identity, in which he argued that the nation-state was no longer fit for purpose, and that it was necessary to create an empire. Addressed to Charles de Gaulle, the head of the French government in exile at the time, Cogeve's long essay constituted a very clever post-war program. Cogeve was a legendary figure. A Jew born and brought up in Russia, then living in Germany and France for a long time, and then in exile in England during the Second World War, he had an intuitive knowledge of all the major European countries. So Cogeve argued that since the nation-state was no longer fit for purpose, and the future of the world belonged to empires, it was first necessary to find out which empires existed in the world today. One is the Anglo-American-dominated empire of liberal ideals, which uses the concept of liberty and human rights as a basis for creating a circle of empires that goes far beyond the Anglo-American one. The other was the Soviet-led empire of communist ideals, based on the idea of universal revolution, which created a circle of empires far beyond the Soviet Union. In such a world map, France, the birthplace of nationalism, is somewhat awkward. The French Revolution launched a wave of nationalism that was once a source of pride for France, but if France had clung to nationalism after the Second World War, it would have become a second, or even third-rate country on the international political stage in the future. So France will have to create an imperial ring that goes beyond that of France. The question then arises, what are the values that are necessary to create an imperial ring that is superior to France's? Cogeve took this opportunity to come up with an imaginative set of proposals for a Latin Catholic empire that France should promote. France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, etc., which were both part of the Latin cultural system, and the Catholic Church, would all be part of the imperial alliance, as would Latin America, which was heavily influenced by Spain and Portugal, and the huge French African colonies. Once established, the Latin Catholic Empire could be placed alongside the Anglo-American Liberal Empire, and the Communist Empire of the Soviet Union. It would be the weakest of the three empires, but it would also be the crucial one. For once this empire was allied with another, the Third Empire would be under tremendous pressure. And Cogeve goes further, saying that the Latin Catholic Empire had a deeper cultural value. The Latin world had a particular cultural and aesthetic taste for life and art, which was shared by all the Latin Catholic countries and which had great appeal abroad. This cultural and aesthetic taste, of which Cogeve speaks, is indeed borne out by our observations in reality. The vast majority of luxury brands in the world today, for example, are produced in Latin countries. Luxury is not just about quality, it is also about a particular kind of taste. We see high quality in Germany, the USA, and the UK, but luxury goods basically belong to Latin countries, and this is related to their particular aesthetic taste. Kojève's concept was so sophisticated that it was not only important for post-war France, but also became a very important ethical basis for the process of European unification. We would say, however, that a conceptual transformation of the post-war process of European unification by the French themselves was not enough. If France had transformed itself into a universalist country, while its neighbors, especially Germany, remained nationalistic, the process of European unification would still have survived only in ideas. Fortunately, then German Chancellor Adenauer also had ideas that went beyond nationalism. Germany's post-war conceptual transformation. Adenauer realized that post-World War I Germany had to fulfill two difficult, but contradictory, tasks at the same time. What were they? The first task was that Germany needed to complete its reconstruction, otherwise the German economy would collapse all the way down to the point where there was a risk of a proletarian revolution, and the whole of Germany would end up in the Soviet imperial circle, which would be terrible for the Western world. The second task was that Germany had to gain the trust of its neighbors, otherwise it would not have a good external environment in which to rebuild. But the precondition for gaining the neighbors' trust was that Germany could not be rebuilt, and if it was rebuilt and Germany became strong, the neighbors would be scared to death, but if Germany was not rebuilt, it could be integrated into the Soviet sphere of influence, and the neighbors would be even more frightened. Germany was thus caught in a dilemma. What was to be done? Adenauer came up with the idea that Germany had to give up the notion of a Germany for Germans and become a Germany for Europeans. In this way, the revival of Germany would be tantamount to a revival of Europe, and Germany would have the opportunity to fulfill two tasks at the same time. So, against this background, Germany joined forces with France and Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg to promote the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Alliance. Under the technical conditions of the time, coal and steel were the two most important raw materials for waging war, and by putting them together in a transnational joint committee, the amount of coal and steel produced by Germany was transparent to the other countries in the committee, as was how the coal and steel would be used. Of course, the amount of coal and steel produced by other countries is also transparent to Germany, which can also exercise its right to call a halt at any time within the Commission if it finds something wrong. In this way, countries can trust each other, and the revival of Germany will be the revival of Europe. The two contradictory tasks which Adenauer had been pursuing could thus be achieved simultaneously. That is to say, France and Germany together underwent a kind of conceptual transformation beyond their own countries, which ultimately led to the process of European unification, and enabled Europe to remain a force to be reckoned with in world politics after the Second World War, when otherwise it might have fallen into total ruin. Today, Germany is the Germany of Europeans and Europe has become the Europe of Germans. Germany has more influence over Europe than at any time in its history, but no one fears it. On the contrary, there are many countries that are arguing that Germany should take more responsibility. It is only by abandoning its nationalist program that Germany has truly honored its national interests and allowed the fruits of its growth to be truly reaped. In the case of the Franco-German coalition, we can also see what has just been said, that the era of the great camps proves that the modern world must be an era of empire. But remember, empire does not mean that you have to oppress others on your own, but that you have to gather others by your own moral appeal, and that your power is only a guarantee on which your morality is enforced. Okay, having finished constructing the imperial order in Europe, how did the two major empires, the USA and the USSR, construct their imperial circles, and how did they compete with each other? This is what we will be talking about next. See you in the next talk.